Now let's proceed and talk about another type, psychological type, that is produced within modern systems. The narcissist. Being kept cocooned in an environment where all error and judgment is excused and even promoted, the mind begins feeling invulnerable, and reality begins being irrelevant because it has very little implication in everyday existence. The individual's activities and choices have very few dire repercussions. In fact, all such repercussions are avoided, and so fear is rendered unproductive, a primitive remnant of a past that prevents total assimilation within this all-encompassing environment. Judgment at this point does not matter either, for the same reasons, and so intelligence ceases to matter outside of providing methods of ascending within the cocooned environment's hierarchies. Nobody learns from their mistakes because they don't have to. They are never too grave to matter much. The only acceptable application of intelligence is to consume and to produce more effectively, or to avoid being assimilated, to dedicate one's time towards remaining a child. And I've talked about this as the byproduct of narcissism, which is the Peter Pan effect. Stupidity is preferred in all other areas. Thoughts are strictly censored, most shamed into silence or dismissed outright, because they can result in a resistance to integration, so they're deemed to be unproductive. Success can only be achieved through integration, so reason directs the mind to become more obtuse and less resistant. The environment has now been dominated by man-made artifices, and reality is excluded or selectively allowed entry. It is fenced away, distanced. This is when the mind becomes a self-absorbed, overconfident, fearless, careless, falsely arrogant, and disrespectful, convinced that its world is the only world, or at least as probable a world as any other. It begins gaining an untested sense of self-esteem and a false sense of empowerment, eventually resulting in a total disconnection from reality. In fact, disconnecting from the world is its ideal state, its progress towards enlightenment. The mind has now been encased in its own conceptions, placed in a safe box, and given that it is sheltered against anything that might correct its delusions, it becomes lost in itself, arrogant and demanding, increasingly self-absorbed and self-referential. Its maturity is retarded, as it does not have to mature at all. We see this effect in domestication. This is a self-love based on delusion, a blind self-love, and based on an absence of self-consciousness or the humbling effects of reality. Narcissism in its many forms is the outcome. The individual begins living in his own world, or one given to him, and since it is a more pleasant world full of more positive to it messages and flattering contexts, it abandons itself to the pleasures of uncontrolled hedonism. Hedonism becomes its ideal, its only way of measuring value and evaluating quality. At this point, the mind will defend the other's right to exist in his own little world, if it does not disturb his own. The mind is now conveniently convinced that reality is a matter of personal taste, or a human construct that can be altered with mere thoughts and casual gestures, or with further detachments. When the real world disturbs its plans, it dives deeper into fantasy, losing itself in pleasure. Pleasure is the only reward it can accept. It indicates social success for it. Now the mind is unable to do without its place within the system. It depends on the system more and more to protect it from the world and to give it that choice of escaping into fantasy worlds. It becomes complacent and detached because the system is now protecting it from its own stupidity and weakness. At this point, the mind's ideals become detached from reality. They turn fantastic, unrealistic, infantile, Self-hatred underlies this process. Hating one's past is essentially a hatred of everything that determined the present. Dissatisfaction with the world is a dissatisfaction with everything that preceded it and that made it possible. Dissatisfaction with the world is really dissatisfaction with existence. Alienation from the world is an alienation from existence. The mind now dives deeper still, deeper into self, into itself, or into the systemic context it has been given to escape the world that cares not for its comforts and interests. At no point does the mind consider reevaluating its own positions, its own premises and judgments. In other words, changing itself in relation to the world. At no point does it dare question the context it was given and it has grown accustomed to. It cannot endure confronting the world outside this safety net. It is completely absorbed, self-absorbed. It sees itself in every surface placed before it. It admires its own brilliance in every wall that surrounds it. It loses itself in its own gaze. Its horizons are contained within its own skull, because there the artifices become plausible. They become perfect, because in there he can be trained and left to wallow in his own imagery. This mind is, sometimes male mind, is in love with this image, this artifice, this artificial environment. It sometimes prefers artificiality and fantasy to the real world. Such a mind does not even know where to begin if it's so dared to break free from this, having been sheltered for so long. And what small doses he has experienced of reality and he has managed to endure have taught him that such an engagement might shock him to death. He does not think his self-image outside the reflection of these mirrored walls will satisfy him, and so he does not dare to look. He has invested too much time and effort in placing himself within the context he accepted early on, and his identification has been shaped for so long by these that anything that confronts its premises would seem like a loss of self. He feels he might go mad if he were to even entertain the possibility of escape. He might be right. In fact, he does go partially mad, as narcissism and schizophrenia are symptoms of insanity, but are lost within the sea of comforting and taken as a natural product of modern stress or adolescent rebelliousness. His teen years are the time when he puts on the clothes chosen for him, and reluctantly, often with spite, he stepped into the box. It is when the schism commenced.